What's going on, everybody? It's FREEDO here for Your Overwatch. Today's video is a special treat. I got a chance to interview the head coach of the LA Gladiators, Dpei, which is really cool because the LA Gladiators is one of the teams that we featured on this channel more than many others, particularly because they're so willing to be creative and come up with their own strategies. They respect the meta, but also take the risk to innovate, which most teams don't do. If you want to check out our breakdowns of the LA Gladiators strategies, there'll be cards on screen for you to click. Otherwise, we'll kick off the interview asking Dpei his thoughts on GOATs.
GOATs is interesting in the fact that it's like really deep at this point. If you look back to like a year ago, it was very underdeveloped. You had like Moira in it. People were still wondering Moira on a Zen as the flex support. But I think it's kind of interesting in the fact that it's gotten so deep at this point. Like there's a lot of things going on, and really teams differentiate themselves based on how much they study. So I think it's really interesting that it's deep, but it is getting kind of monotonous. You get like less strides, less meaningful strides. The depth means that, you know, it's harder to see where you're going wrong. So there's good things and there's bad things at that, but yeah, it is what it is.
The interesting thing is, anytime I talk to someone who's in the industry, players or coaches, they often praise GOATs more than you'd expect, and it's kind of for that reason where there is a definite skill cap to be reached. You may not know this, but I'm actually a fan of yours and your team, particularly because it seems to me anyway that you have a different coaching style to how other teams operate, and I think that's evidenced in just your decision making as a team, like what you guys go for, what you clearly put time into. For example, creativity. Do you think that that's a key thing that you strive for, or like what's your consideration when doing this? Because I think what some teams do is prefer to put 100% of their energy towards the main meta rather than diverting even some of that resource to practice other things, because they assume, well, if we just one trick the main meta, we'll be a stronger team overall, rather than like tossing in the odd sim, May, you know, these other things that you guys have done in this stage. And, you know, the most famous one, of course, is the Great Bamboozle, right? Which isn't even a meta comp, but more of a bait and switch rotation. So I'll let you have the floor to explain anything in that regard.
Yeah, we've gone like back and forth with how much variation we want, because the meta is a meta for a reason. Like even going back to season 1, it was dive. You really wanted to play Winston Diva as much as possible in a lot of cases. When Widow is meta, you really want to play Widow, you really want to play Pharah. We try to break out as much as possible. I think it's more effective earlier on when people have less idea of what's going on. But as it kind of gets figured out, it becomes less and less effective, and then you go back towards the meta. So it's interesting. We really like throwing loops, right? And I think it's really good in like one game scenarios, for example. Like I think London is where we had like the most number of off strategies. We had the most number of cheeses in our last year's playoffs, and we had a cheese or like a specific thing on each of the maps that we won against London in the first of the best of 3, and I thought it was really effective. But your fundamentals carry us through, and I think we're also solid on those. So we have to find time balancing between how much we want to be creative, how much we want to throw people off their game, versus how much we want to, you know, practice what is really good, which is the meta. So I think it's like a fine-tuning balance, and each meta is different. Each team we play against is going to be different on how effective we think that's going to be.
And is that a goal top-down based on your preferences or ideas of what's strong, or is that like a personnel thing? Like you got a guy like Surefour, you know, he's got a big hero pool, and, you know, maybe just does he raise his hand in a meeting, be like, can we try sim? And then you just toss it in one day, or like, how does that work out?
It's a little bit of everyone. I think I'm, compared to my assistant coaches are much more like, let's say the meta, like, I don't think this is good because if they counter with this, like, it's very logical, but I think these surprises are very good. So ultimately, I make a lot of the macro decisions for compositions and stuff like that. So I think I'm the one more on the side of risk, whereas my coaching staff and my players are generally on the side of risk aversion. But I think it's good to have a balance so that, you know, if I'm going crazy, someone's got to hold me back a little bit on those things. But it's just a team thing. Like I'll never force my team to run something that would make them uncomfortable. I always ask, like, do you guys think this is good? Or I want to practice this for these reasons. What are your guys' thoughts? Usually we're open for experimentation, and then we actually see, and then it comes down to comfort when it comes down to game time.
Where do you think the game balance should go? Or there's been a lot of talk in the community, for example, and a big hoopla over like locked roles that didn't come in. Do you think that's something that's good for the game, or do you think that there should be balance to move the meta in a different direction? Or do you just not concern yourself with any of this kind of stuff because you just put your nose to the grindstone and get wins by any means necessary?
I'm more of the latter, but I do like have some thoughts on the whole balance situation. I think a 2-2-2 would like make the game easier to balance because it would be much more straightforward. You would only end up with like 3-4 different comps. But at the same time, I think that's very boring. Let's say you can balance it. Like if it goes towards 2-2-2, you'll probably see a lot of Orisa, a lot of balls. You will never see Ryan Zarya ever again. I'm confident of that, or like pretty sure of that. I think it's like bad for the game overall to be too rigid with the 2-2-2. But I understand why like 3-3 has been really dominant. It's really hard to balance with a lot of these hybrid classes with Brigade and tanks coming together, supports coming together. It is like really hard to stop these compositions. So I think something in between is good, like a 1-1-1 with like 3 flexes might be like the best way to go. But I don't have a strong opinion. I just trust Blizzard, and whichever one they do, I'm looking for the best strategy, more or less.
Yeah, it's tough because although I would agree on everything you said, we've said the same thing about Ryan Zarya in 2-2-2, for example, but the issue is that we always have meta-enforced lack of diversity, if that makes sense. So when everything's on the table and everything's an option, then mostly nothing is an option because there's only one best thing. So, there's no easy way to go about this, where Overwatch it's more of a straightforward game than like even other Blizzard titles, where like their RTS games, for example, it's pretty hard to have just one build, for example, that's going to work. There's just so many other complexities to the game. So it'll be interesting to see where they move with that into the next season. So what's your ideal meta, I guess? That's a question that everyone has debates about, because no matter what, we're going to have a meta in this format. Is there one that you prefer or one you're afraid of? Some people think Bunker is going to be worse than Goats, for example.
Just really quick, I don't think I prefer 2-2-2. I think 1-1-1 with flexing is good, but I'm not exactly sure. But as far as like which meta I would prefer, I think a meta where you can play a lot of different things and you have to change really quickly. Like the meta is just constantly changing. I think that's a meta I would prefer. I think Blizzard should make more aggressive balance changes, because I think it not only keeps the game fresh, but it also make sure that we don't get into like these stagnant metas where one thing is dominant, because it takes people time to figure out a meta. I don't think like really aggressive changes are great, but definitely more aggressive than what they have been doing, right? Like if we look at what's been changed to like hurt Goats over the past like year, it's been very little. It hasn't been aggressive. It's been very small changes, and they come at like long periods of time too. Like we thought Diva Matrix was this one thing that would stop Goats, right? Because spam would become better, and Junkrat and Pharah got buffed by like 10% or something like that. But it's really not good enough, essentially, and they did it very slowly. I think a faster iteration on these things would be much better, and faster and or more aggressive. I think fast, small iterations are good, but I also think, big aggressive changes might also be interesting just to shake up the game.
Yeah, that makes sense. Also, I think they don't really flex the muscle of the allowance to go back on bad decisions, because they could be making changes during the stage that never see pro play, but go back on it, fix it later, have it shored up by the end of the stage so that it's ready for the next stage. That kind of stuff would definitely be fine. It does make the public player base a bit of guinea pigs in that way, but I think we'd get over it for the sake of getting to the destination a little bit faster. Another interesting thing, I don't know if you saw this in the patch notes coming up, but there's a major change to Assault. And this is important to me because I actually think that the game format and game modes are a big reason why the meta kind of stabilizes around very limited concepts that play those game modes so well. So, for example, on Assault, for those that don't know listening, or if you haven't seen it, but there's the new rule where you almost automatically get a respawn on B, meaning that snowballing is just essentially not a thing. The window of time to do it is so small that it's unlikely that the defending team won't have a full 6 defense by the time that the attacking team caps A then gets to B.
Yeah, I think for the 2 CP changes, it should make Goats a little less dominant on Assault maps, especially if bunker comps do become stronger on these Assault maps. I think it will be a really good change, and I think it's just to make the game mode healthier overall, because you shouldn't lose the whole game because of a risky defense on point A, I think is what Blizzard's saying. It causes too much variance, and it's already a game mode that's like a lot of variance, right? Like you get one pick on B, you might be able to snowball. And I think it'll help the variance and make it more defense favored, which I think is better overall compared to the attack favored meta that it is now on 2CP, where you see 4 to 6 points on average on these 2CPs. And I think it's overall healthy for the changes, but compared to like payload or hybrid, I think there's a good reason why goats is strong, or like one comp is strong. If you look at it, you would like to hot swap everything going into first point to second point to third point. Like if you could have all the ultimates in the game, you would want to play a different comp on each of them. But one comp is like good enough from first point, and then it's good enough on second point. Even though second point has like a ton of high grounds, goats is still good because it can contest the high grounds decently well if you're a well executed goats team. First point is really good for goats a lot of the times for these hybrid maps, so you just stay on goats. And then third point a lot of the times are good for goats, so you just say goats because it's good 2 out of the 3 points. So I think there is map design reasons for that, because Blizzard, generally the maps look very, very similar, being that first point's really, for hybrids at least, first point's really compact, really good for tanks. It's really compact space. Second point's these high grounds. You go through what most people call as a street phase, where the payload's being pushed under some large high grounds. And then third point is some enclosed space again, where it's very narrow. Example, Eichenwald, Hollywood, they're all the same. They're all like fairly similar. So I think that's a problem with map design more so than anything, because even in the past you would see Winston D.Va dominate a lot of these things, and it's the same map. It's just that the meta was so good for Winston D.Va that it was good at all points, because you could outplay on first point and still beat some tank comp. So I think there is something to say about the map design being very straightforward and very formulaic, but there's a reason GOATS is good outside of just the game type or the objective type as well.
Oh, right. Yeah, there's about 1,000 reasons I think that we've learned over the course of the year. But the map design argument is always interesting to me, because although I agree, I also then look to see what happens when map design is pushed another direction, where, for example, a lot of the players and the community isn't a big fan of Paris, but that's the kind of map that I'm like, okay, well, this is just made for Bunker to be good, but yet at the same time, players just don't like it. So yes, definitely they could balance the maps in order to make it even more punishing to have the wrong comp, or sort of a catch-all comp, which is essentially what you're saying, a comp that can play all stages of the map. But in order to do that, it has to be like aggressively balanced. Whereas, yeah, I've always agreed. I think the maps are just about the same structurally, and at least for how the engagements work. But at the same time, if they went the other direction, would we have a different problem where then it's like too much the other way, and it's a big challenge. So yeah, I don't know if there's ever a solution with that, because especially casual players really hate playing Paris. I like it because it's like, well, you have to have a distinct strategy and teamwork and go at it, but it's like, I don't want to do any of that. You know what I mean? Like, that sounds terrible. Like, I just want to be able to run at the thing and play the video game simply. So I don't know how to square that necessarily. The problem that I always come up to is that we have this goal of expecting Overwatch strats to be really diverse and fluid, and counterpicking to be a big mainstay. But what has always boiled down to is that a core meta would be established, and then small alterations on that would be the case. So with that being, would you prefer other MOBA formats to come into place? Like, do you have any opinions on hero bans or other more drastic modes that could shake up the gameplay? Or, some people like the fact that there's a refined meta. You can have that opinion too, obviously. So do you have an opinion on which way that you think the games play best in?
Yeah, I at least feel best when there's like more aggressive changes, balance changes, and then we have less time to figure it out so that the meta doesn't settle. A lot of the times, like, people aren't on the same page as far as what is the best until like a couple of teams decide this is the best, and then they just set that, and then other OWL teams just follow. This is like very typical, I think, of what happens. Whoever's doing the best, you just copy. And I think that's really lame, because a stage lasts five weeks or however long, and then they just copy you, and then everyone can understand the concept, play those heroes most likely, and then be decent in the meta if they just copy you. I think it's better if we just have a lot of more aggressive balance changes so that the game is still fresh, and then you reward teams that actually have deeper strategy or better understanding of the game. And it goes into that feel of like counterpicking and stuff like that, because teams with the better conception will be able to make more unique hero swaps in different situations. Like, the beginning of every meta from based on scrims is like it's always really interesting because you get see a lot of different thought processes going in, and it makes the game more heads up, I would say, rather than just very, very refined. And I think both are good for the viewer. It just depends. Like if a viewer wants a more stable, like, oh, okay, we want to play 3-3 every single time, and then here are unique comps, and then we get into the nuances of 3-3. I think that's fair. But if viewers wanted to see more counterpicking and more like the vision of Overwatch that has been described by the balance team, I think you would need much more aggressive balance changes and in faster iterations as well.
I definitely personally agree. I will try to devil's advocate a bit though. First though, I think it was always interesting that in previous eras of competitive Overwatch, we would get that effect that you're talking about because there essentially wasn't any competition in between events. So you'd get a new event that's on a whole new patch, and almost during the event, the meta would get figured out or at least refined, and you know, the crazy new strats. Like for example, Beyblade came during a tournament where everyone assumed it was like, you nano the Rhine, and everyone was doing that. Then one team just started doing Beyblade. It's like, oh wait, this is way better than nanoing the Reinhardt. So that sort of is exciting. However, of course, the downside is you have less refinement, and some might argue that teams that are really good, like it biases towards a different type of team. And I would definitely fall agreeing with you that I think it's at least a better viewing experience. However, to the downside to that, though, as Blizzard makes these decisions, what say you about the problem of what we already saw happen last year, for example, which looks to maybe be happening again this year, where by the time we get to stage 4 in the playoffs, the patch is much different than you know, the previous multiple stages before it. Does that cause problems with like the power level of teams going into the playoffs, or even, for example, playing an entirely different meta? Is that a concern, or is it just sort of goes with the territory of playing Overwatch? This is sort of a personality that it has.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately it's up to Blizzard on how they want to balance the game and how they want Overwatch League to be viewed. If they wanted it to be like one meta the whole time with like slight changes, then you would see dive the whole time like last season, and then it randomly switches to like a lot of Orisa comp at the very end of last season, right? I don't care as a coach. I just care about winning, so it really doesn't matter to me which one it ends up going towards, so long as I get like an ample amount of time to prepare for it. I think it's fine. But for Blizzard, it just matters on what they want to favor, because like League, you have like a lot of tournament formats. For League of Legends, you have a lot of tournament format, so there is a meta that develops within that tournament, like you were saying. And just like in old school competitive Overwatch, there was a lot of tournaments, less so like leagues over time. So you would see a meta develop within a tournament based on the teams, based on the strengths of those teams. You would see that a tournament meta develop. Whereas I think in a league, you always end up with what is best generally. You end up with a more close to optimal meta. So I think it just depends on which way Blizzard wants to veer towards. If they want it to be like look more like a tournament meta and each stage is like a tournament, or if they want it to make it look more standard throughout and have it be more straightforward to follow. Like basketball is very easy to watch, but even that meta has changed, but it's changed over time. You have like a center, you have some shooting guards, you have forwards who are diverse, and then you kind of figure out, oh, okay, like my guard should be someone who distributes the ball really well. Maybe one of the other guards shoots 3. My center should have like some sort of defensive presence in the middle, and then we kind of figure out everything after that. And it's very easy for me to jump back into watching basketball, even though I haven't watched it in 10 years, right? That might be a bad example because basketball's changed quite a bit. But like football, for example, you know what everything is going to happen. You know every position on what they're generally supposed to be doing. So I think a roll lock would help with that. But at the same time, you might get really stagnant in a bad way. So it depends on how Blizzard wants to approach that.
Definitely. Do you have a take on why we don't see more teams take like the Chengdu route, for example, or even the Gladiators route, which I think is meta strong but willing to innovate to some degree? Your team really stands out in that way, where a lot of teams just refuse flat out to even attempt that.
I think it's for simplicity of strategy, one, and then two, also just because it's some sort of risk. Not running the meta comp, if you know exactly what the opponent is going to run and then you choose to mirror, you're never at a strategic disadvantage. At least from a logical standpoint. If you're running the same comp and they run the same comp when the sides are flipped, when you're flipped attack defend, it's never bad. So you can never get blamed for that decision. But if you do something weird, if you do anything off meta, you ultimately end up in, did I make the right strategic decisions, or did I fail the players by choosing some suboptimal comp? So I think that's why you end up more and more towards like meta decisions. People experiment at the beginning of stages and then go more and more towards risk adverse solutions, because teams don't want to take those risks because they feel like they can play straight up, or they have a good chance playing straight up, which I think is like very valid.
Okay, you see, Dpei, I tricked you. This is my trap door now. So now we move into the next question, which is, do you have an opinion on the Houston Outlaws situation, where it was a lot of conversation? You know, does it make sense to try to just mirror GOATs? Is that the best possible way to try to win against, you know, arguably the best GOATs team in the world? Or if you're in that situation, you know, do you at least entertain the fans by losing with a flashier comp, attempting to play something that you feel stronger in?
I don't like, no offense, I don't think it matters what the fans want for what you should play. That doesn't make any sense to me. Let me take a look at the Houston Outlaws schedule, because I think 1 week they had to play Vancouver, right? And then someone else as well. So they played Vancouver in week 2. Maybe they could have set up more like counter 3-3 comps, but then they had like winnable games against Fusion and Shanghai the next week. So every time you go and develop these off-meta comps, you lose the opportunity to practice the standard. And when you're close in ranking, or you feel like you're close in ranking with these other teams, why would you not want to just play standard in something that will develop over time, right? From week 1 to week 5, which is the strategy best to develop? It's probably the one that puts you best at the meta comp overall, unless you can perfect an off meta comp that will always work. But we see even for Chengdu, it slowly tails off. The effectiveness slowly tails off as you see how to beat their one trick, right? And it's not meta flexible. So when a team knows how to counter it, they really know how to counter it. And they might be able to play into their counter a little bit, but if one is just strategically better, they should lose heads up, right? A lot of the time, if I have Rock and you have Scissors, if you really know how to use a Scissor well, you can beat the Rock, but for the most part, the Rock has a huge advantage. So I don't think it's any team's bad decision to play the meta, maybe for particular matches or particular instances, but to go towards the meta, I think is safe. And you're fighting against the teams in your ranking of standings. So like, let's say Outlaws plays against Vancouver week 1, and then week 2, they play against teams that they think they can beat. They could have just been spending week 2 or week 1 prepping for the more winnable teams, and maybe they lose to Vancouver no matter what. They don't give them their best strategy because it's not worth the time to develop that. It's just an argument on how fast people can learn, as well as how much time you think it takes to work the meta comp. And we talked about GOATs being infinitely deep. I think you can spend more time with GOATs. You just have to be spending that time efficiently, is the problem with practice. And I have no idea how the Houston Outlaws works internally, but from a theoretical standpoint, I don't think it's like so bad to practice 3-3, because it gives you a better chance against teams that you can beat later on.
So I hear that you're going for coach for Team USA. What's the deal?
Yeah, it's that right now you can vote in whoever you would like, and I think that voting period has passed, and then it goes on into a runoff of the top candidates from there that got voted, and then from there it's top 150 players select the coach.
Do you have thoughts about Team USA? Because here's the thing, I'm from USA, and my team always disappoints me, because we go in with a head full of steam and then somehow go up against South Korea in the first round, or a team that we look past completely with Team UK. Why is Coach Dpei going to take us to the promised land? And at very least, like, the second round would be nice. What do you got to offer?
I think a lot of the teams in the past kind of didn't take it as seriously, and I think that's like a big issue. It was during an off season or stuff like that, and I think the strategy wasn't quite developed. Like, coaching as a whole wasn't developed. It was a lot more player driven. So with player driven teams, you end up with a lot of randomness, I will say, like randomness in execution, randomness is strategy. So I think what I provide is like a strong top down vision, not just necessarily with comps, not that I'm always top down with strategy, but that I have a clear vision on how I want the team to run. And I think the biggest thing is getting a team to coalesce into a team. I think looking back to last year, UK was actually a very good team despite hitting underweight, maybe for their weight class per pound of player. And I think they were just a better team because they were much more coordinated. They were holistically better. Whereas I felt like some of the teams in the tournament were just more or less like based on individual skill more so than anything. So I think what I can provide is like a true a true team more so than anything, because that's kind of been my specialty going into Owl. You see, no matter what version of the Gladiators, we always play team play. No matter what meta we're in, it's always a team play based meta. It's always a strong team play based team. So I think that's what I can provide to the team, as well as really strong direction. The team that coalesced into a team the most has a better chance at BlizzCon is essentially the reason, because you need a true team to be able to adapt on the fly, not just between the games, but between like rounds or between fights. You need to be able to adapt. So I think that takes really intelligent players. I think that takes smart players, but I think it also takes people to be able to talk to each other. So how I would choose it wouldn't be like super in depth right now, but I do think you would need to fit into the culture, and I would enforce some basic level of culture, because I think I'm very strict on culture, and I think that's what I provide as well as a head coach, as well as strategy. I think that's one of the things I provide as a head coach. So you would need to fit in. You can't be a lone wolf on yourself. Like, I'm going to tell you to communicate. I'm going to make sure that you're communicating whatever plan that you have so that we can all be successful together.
All right, man. Well, it was a lot of fun talking to you. Thanks for letting me pick your brain. And until we get to speak again, hopefully maybe I can bump into you at the World Cup, give you a high five as you're leading Team USA to victory.
Yeah, we'll definitely hope for that. We're going for the gold, right?
I'm just happy to get past round one at this point, but yeah, the gold would be great.
Okay, thanks, man.